Today we are talking to John Hooper, the author of The Italians. Welcome to Radara, and thank you very much for your time and your comments. Our readers are very excited to hear more from you and about the book, The Italians.
Thank you, Manish. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Why the book? How did you end up writing this book, and what brought you to the subject that probably you were familiar to begin with?
Well, in a way, you're right. Why didn't I write it sooner? I had written a book about the Spanish, which had then been updated twice and had been a great success. It was a bestseller when it came out, and I thought of doing the same thing when in 1994 I was posted by the Guardian newspaper to Italy. But my job there was not to be the correspondent for Italy alone. I was the Southern Europe correspondent, so I was constantly traveling, and I got Italy, if you like, in flashes of involvement. That was part of the reason. The other reason was that I had written the book about Spain because I was originally posted there as a foreign correspondent after the death of Spain's late dictator, General Franco. And the country then underwent a huge transformation, which changed perceptions, but not maybe enough. And I wrote this book to say, look, this country has changed out of all recognition, that you have an idea based on the 1930s, the pre-Civil War period of people like Hemingway, and that Spain has gone forever. And I'm going to tell you about the new one. And I thought that Italy was about to undergo a similar period of very radical change because there had been a huge drive against corruption. Silvio Berlusconi, who was an utterly new phenomenon, had come on the scene, and there were big changes taking place on Sicily with regard to the mafia. And all of that made me feel I've got a similar story here to the one that I had in Spain, and maybe I can do a similar book. And then really, in a way that is very typical of Italy, everything got put under wraps. The big change never happened. Berlusconi stayed in power for less than a year. The anti-corruption drive was quietly brushed under the carpet. And so I suddenly found myself thinking, well, the only book that I can write about Italy has got to be one that's genuinely interpretative. It's got to be one that actually explains what makes this country tick. And I just didn't feel myself qualified to write that book when I left Italy in 1999. And I never thought I would come back, because normally correspondents, we don't come back, unlike diplomats. And pure chance did bring me back 4 or 5 years later. And this time I was able to be the correspondent just for Italy. And I was able to concentrate on my subject, if you like, much more closely. Even then, though, Italy is such a deceptive and elusive place that for a long time I still didn't feel ready to start. It was only after I'd been back for about 4 years that I started to make notes of all the things that would strike a foreigner when they came here, all the paradoxes and anomalies of this country, and started to try and make sense of them. And that's how the book originated.
Fascinating. Could you give us a little bit of background, a little bit further more details on, you're touching 3 broad areas, the geography, the history, and the traditions in the book. And maybe if you want, we can start with the geography, that how the nation came about, which is a relatively young nation.
Yes.
And what brought the nation together, and how the geography has shaped Italy as we know today.
Well, I think what you said about the the nation being very young. It dates from the 1870s, so it's younger than the United States, and that youth, I think, shows through in many ways. It's very interesting when you're watching the television or reading the newspapers, the constant reiteration of the word "our." So it's our country. Such and such is happening to us. It's as though subconsciously they're trying to nation build and tell each other that they are one society, because up until the unification of Italy was many different countries, and the consciousness of that still weighs on people today. I've been to places where you will see a little place called the Dogana, and the Dogana is a customs house, and you come across these often in the middle of nowhere, down country lanes, and they are what they're described as. They were once customs houses between, for example, the Papal State, which was governed by the popes, and Tuscany, or which was a grand duchy, or between the Papal State and, to the south of it, the Kingdom of Naples. These were all different countries, and you had to go through, just the way you would from, say, France to England. You had to go through with your passport, and you maybe be searched, and certainly have to declare goods and pay tariffs. All of that was 150 years ago. So Italians remain very varied in their traditions. And one of the points of the book actually is that it's not so much the geography that divides the country, it's its history. I start off by talking about the geography in a way to kind of give people who've never been here a picture of the country, or give a picture of the country to people who've maybe only come to one part and don't realize how varied it is. And then I make the point that if the real dividing factor were geography in Italy, then you would expect the East and the West to be divided, because you have running down the center of the country a mountain range. But in fact, the division is between North and South. And the division comes about because of history, because after a certain point, the South is comprehensively another country, and it's united within itself, but differentiated from the center and the North. And so the history of Italy is always present. I actually quote one of Italy's most famous intellectuals, the philosopher Benedetto Croce, who said that we are products of the past and we live immersed in it. And that's a very Italian view. People have different traditions and different recollections depending on the part of the country that they come from, though that is now changing as people intermarry and so on. Italy is becoming a more homogeneous country, but there are still very significant variations.
So history is a far greater influence than geography has been.
Yes, I think so. It influences many different attitudes and traditions. It makes for a country which looks back at different pasts, you know. For example, up in the northeast of Italy, they have a tradition of having been invaded and run over by any number of different invaders, but also they belonged at one point to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so there's that legacy up there. Then you go down to areas like, well, where I'm sitting at the moment in Rome, the traditions here are formed by the fact that this formed part of a state that was ruled by the popes. And there is it's interesting that one of the reactions to that is that you get a higher level, I think, of blasphemy here and in the surrounding area than almost any other part of, if not any other part of Italy. The Umbrians particularly take blasphemy to a highly developed level in their swearing, because this was kind of one of the very few ways that you could get back at your rulers. They were the church, and therefore they couldn't really be questioned. So one of the very few ways in which you could undermine their authority or console yourself, perhaps, was by blaspheming.
Would you delve a little bit deeper into the geographic divide that still influences or still matters before we move on to the historical and the traditional part of the book chapters that you think that readers should be aware of, or they are not generally well known?
Well, I think that often people come to Italy with an image perhaps formed by a holiday on the Amalfi Coast, which is south of Naples, of a rather balmy country with palm trees and blue skies and blue sea. Or they've come to one of the cities and maybe don't have any very clear idea of what the whole country looks like. And it is enormously varied. The whole of the central part, as I mentioned earlier, is mountainous, and the people who live there are very different from the people who live on the coastal plain to either side of that mountain range. You know, they're like mountain people the world over. They're quite tough, quite robust. They are people who like a hearty meal, and who are snowbound in some cases for much of the winter, or at least in cities like L'Aquila in the center, which where the snow can start to fall in late fall and go through until early spring. The other variation that you see is, well, let's start at the bottom, at Sicily. There again, you have mountains, and quite high ones, and you have a huge volcano, which is Etna. And then you also have that balmier, more kinder climate in the coastal areas. Then as you move up, again, you come to another highland area in the center, very, very little known area called Basilicata, which is really quite rugged and has a character that's utterly different from either of the regions on either side of it, because, for one thing, the mafia has never penetrated Basilicata, and I think it does have something to do with the character of the people. The regions to either side are Calabria, which is also has very significant highlands and a coastal area. And then on the other side, you have Puglia, which is flat as a pancake. Then going further up, you come to Rome, and I think Lazio, which is the area around Rome, is again pretty much what you would expect of Italy, and characterized by those umbrella pines that feature in any number of Roman epics. On the other side is a coastal area that's part of the Abruzzo region, and then going further up you have the Marche. These are where some of the most popular resorts are to be found on the coast. But inland you get to Tuscany and Umbria, which probably can form they figured on an awful lot of postcards and in an awful lot of illustrations in books and magazines. Very beautiful regions with undulating hills rather than mountains, and producing some of the best oil to be found, and some of the best wine too, to be found in Italy. But then further up, even within Tuscany, you get to a heavily industrialized area just outside Florence. And the industrialization grows and grows as you go north, so that in Emilia-Romagna, which is the area around Bologna, you've got quite a deal of industry. And as you then go further up, you come to the Po Valley, this wide valley around the river Po that flows from the Alps in the northwest down to Venice in the northeast. And that valley is among the most industrialized areas of Europe. It is not picturesque, though some of the cities that stand on the Via Po are extremely picturesque. Vicenza, Verona, which was where Romeo and Juliet were meant to have lived, and so on. And then further still, you get to the Alps, and here you get to not only a geographical variety, but a cultural variety, because over in the west, in Piedmont, you have plenty of people who either speak a dialect of French or some French patois, or the language which is often described as Languedoc or Occitan. Going further over, you have a German-speaking area, which produces some of the most outstanding winter athletes that Italy has. And then going yet further across, you come to an area where you're getting into this mixture that was brought about by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you have people who will speak Slovenian or a dialect of Slovenian, and another language which is similar to one spoken further west. Just anecdotally, I was driving down from Austria to Trieste, which is the main city in the northeast, actually just a few months ago, and I stopped at a hard shoulder area where you could park, and got out of the car. I had to make a phone call, and I was looking at a container for trash, and it had on it a label asking people not to put particular stuff in there, and it was in 8 languages. That gives you an idea of just what a kaleidoscope Italy is.
Fascinating, fascinating. The Italians are known, the modern version of Italy is known for its art and engineering capabilities, and also creativity and innovation. But what are the historical trends that people should be aware of and generally are not well aware of that has shaped the Italian society as we know today?
Well, I think that one of them is, and this is a central theme of the book, that the relationship of Italians with outsiders has frequently been very thorny, difficult. And in the South, they were subject to a one wave after another of foreign invaders. You name them, they've come to southern Italy. Greeks, Romans, Arabs, later Normans from the other end of Europe, Scandinavians, and then French and Spanish. So you have a half of the country which, until the period of unification, had no real experience of ruling itself. In the latter stages, you can say, well, yes, there was a Spanish dynasty that became so Italianized that they were virtually Italians. But for the bulk of their history, southern Italians had no responsibility for themselves. And I think that that has made it a very problematic region. Going further north, in the center, that was ruled, as I said earlier, by the popes. So that too was anomalous, and it's left a mark on that part of the country. I think that it explains why Rome is a rather conformist and traditional city, because it's been the influence of the Vatican, the leaders of the Catholic Church, on the area. Further north still, you get a tradition which is very different to the one in the south, which was during the Middle Ages of Italians being able to rule themselves far more than in any country in Europe. The little city-states that grew up there under the protection of the old Holy Roman Empire, but kind of made themselves independent from it. These little city-states like Siena, Florence, and many others scattered across the center north of the country during the period of what's called the communes. They were ruled in very different ways often, but they were ruled by the inhabitants, and that, I think, implanted a kind of civic sense there that you don't see in the south. I'm, by the way, repeating a theory that was first formed by an American anthropologist stroke historian, Robert Putnam, and I think that there's a lot of truth in the theory that he put forward, that this civic pride and consciousness that exists in the north of the country, and which conspicuously does not exist in the south, has its roots in history. So for all those reasons, that has been important. But there's one other factor, which is that while the north, until relatively recently in historical terms, was not conquered by foreigners, it was by the 18th century. That here in Europe, of course, we tend to think of that as being pretty modern. Before that, the North was vulnerable. These city-states, which produced some of the greatest culture in Europe, Florence being the outstanding example, Siena another, these states didn't realize, because they were very rich and successful and fashionable. You only have to read Shakespeare to see how much the British, for example, admired the Italians in that period. What they didn't realize was just how vulnerable they were. And that was brought home to them, actually, around about the time that Shakespeare was writing, when armies from France and Spain and Germany came into the peninsula and cut through the defenses of these cities like a knife through the hot knife through butter, with the result that there was created a sense of always needing, that kind of mirrored what you had in the South. Here I think you have got a communality, that there was a sense that you need to be wary of foreigners, be nice to them, but, you know, keep looking after your own interests, because, and that may require you to change sides very quickly. Don't get too idealistic. Don't nail your colors too much to the mast. And I think that that is a characteristic that has survived to this day. People will often move around, for example, between political parties in Parliament with an ease and a lack of social disapproval which is striking. I saw some figures the other day, and the number of MPs or lawmakers in the current Parliament who have changed sides runs to 3 figures. It is a staggering number of people who have given up the party for which they were elected and gone off and joined another one. And that kind of flexibility, if you like, I think is very much deriving from Italian history.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In the chapter 10, you talk about the attitude change, the l'Italien. Would you describe it a little bit more and the various things that you bring out from the past and in the recent history?
Yeah, this is the chapter about women in Italy, and it is one of the areas which has seen the greatest change of late. The picture is enormously uneven. What you see looking back is that at some times and in some social classes, women in Italy were at least the equal in terms of emancipation of their counterparts elsewhere in Europe. I cite, for example, a princess who turns up in Goethe's travels through Italy, who I describe as being as independent and sassy and feisty as any modern feminist, but she was sharing her country with women who were used as little more than pack horses. The position of women in the South particularly has been very downtrodden. Further north, much less so. Women had a different role to play in society, particularly in places like Umbria, in Tuscany, the Marche, in those areas which were centered on big farmhouses. Women had a very definite and important role to play in keeping the whole show running. And I think that has influenced the way that women are regarded in those areas. Having said that, though Italians came quite late to the liberation that women saw in the 19th century, the very tentative liberation, I might say, but nevertheless it was a change that was brought about. But then they caught up very quickly, and they, by the 1920s, were probably on a par with many others in Europe, and probably ahead of many others in terms of the respect that they enjoyed and the rights that they enjoyed. Still very limited, though. Then along comes fascism. In the 1920s, Italy becomes a fascist state under its dictator Benito Mussolini, and he clamps down really, really hard. His view was that, the same as Hitler's, that women were suitable for the kitchen and the children and the bedroom. And this becomes a real motif of the regime, and women are, despite the fact that, ironically, certain Italian women had a very important influence on Mussolini himself, one of whom, even more ironically, was Jewish. But the outcome of the fascist regime is that women are reduced to a very menial role in society, and they only really recapture it, and even then I think very much partially, in the war, and particularly in the partisan movement. I use an example of one of the heroines of the partisan movement, who was almost tortured to death, but who refused to speak. And coming out of the war, many of these women who had worked as, risked their lives carrying messages for the partisans, or actually taking part, like that woman, on the front line, they did earn a great deal of respect. And then you get a very weird period, because you go into the 1950s, and Christian democracy by that time has become the overriding political narrative in Italy, and very heavily influenced by the Vatican, very heavily influenced by Catholic teaching, and women are, they would like, given a similar role to the one that they'd had in the 1920s and 1930s. But it doesn't quite work. I think that the war, as in many countries, the Second World War brought women out of a situation in which they had very clearly defined roles and put them into an altogether new one. And that can't really be undone. And you get this strange paradox, which I underline in the book, of a country where women are going, the majority, going to church on a Sunday and respecting what the church has to say about their place. And at the same time, you get the Italian woman becoming a sex symbol in the cinema. The most outstanding example, of course, is Sophia Loren, but there were many others. Italian starlets were hugely popular throughout the 60s and even into the 70s. And, you know, as I say, many of them romped around the screen with not a great deal of clothing on. So you have this kind of strange juxtaposition that I think to some extent still exists in people's minds about Italy. On the one hand, it's seen as being quite risque and, you know, where you've got sexy ladies and sexy guys and all this Latin lover stuff. And then on the other hand, there's the image of Italy as being the most Catholic and traditional country in Western Europe, which is in many ways true. So strange kind of paradox. It's one of the paradoxes that I try to bring out in the book, because Italy is a very, very paradoxical country.
Mm-hmm. And you continue to explore that more in the next two chapters, one focusing on the family matters and the other one focusing on a relationship between men and women.
Yeah, absolutely. There are many mysteries involved in this, and I think that this is one of the most difficult areas to tackle for anybody like myself who's trying to, if you like, take a snapshot of a country or a society or a nation. And I said this in my book on Spain, the new Spaniards. I say the same thing, that you're really you don't have the kind of statistical support for your theories and opinions that you do in other areas, or at least they are available, and I cite many of them, but I think they've all got to be taken with a big pinch of salt, because people lie to pollsters, and nowhere, I think, do they lie more than when they're talking about their sex lives. So I always approach these subjects in as impressionistic a way as I possibly can. I talk about the romantic side of the Italians, and one of the things that strikes me even now is the number of graffiti that you see around Italian cities, in which one partner, normally the male I suspect, declares undying love for the other one. You see these written up in the most improbable places, and sometimes the boy, to prove his love for the girl, will put up a graffito in a place that he risks his life getting to. You know, you see these written up, for example, on the bridges that go over highways, and in order to have done them, it makes your hands go clammy to think of the risks that they took. So there's that, and there is the poll evidence to suggest that Italians have quite satisfactory sex lives. There is definitely there has been a huge change in the degree to which couples have sex outside marriage, and particularly, I would say, the change has been in sex before marriage, which has changed a lot over the years. But just how prevalent that is, I think, is one of the mysteries, because I notice that, and I mentioned this in the book, that on the one hand, possibly for religious come cultural reasons, Italian young men, and to some extent young women, are reluctant to use, or more reluctant to use, contraception than many others in Europe. And if you have the high level of sexual relationships that the polls indicate, then you would expect that the result of that would be a high level of unwanted pregnancies. But you don't get that. In fact, you get a very, very low figure, which makes me suspect that perhaps people are not as free, young people, as they make out when they talk to people taking surveys. And that is also borne out by something else. And I think you see this also in other Latin countries, which is the strong preference for very enduring relationships before marriage. Often Italian girls will get involved with Italian boys at 17, 18, and this relationship then goes on until they get married in their late 20s. And that's something that is reflected in the use of the word for fiancé to describe boyfriend. I mean, there's two words. There's, and it's the same for girlfriend, but just on boyfriend, it's ragazzo is boy, and you'll often hear a young woman refer to mio ragazzo, my boyfriend. But she could also, and it depends where, this varies from part to part of the country, but she might also refer to him as my fidanzato, and literally that means my engaged one, my fiancé. And certainly when the relationship ages beyond a certain point, then even though they're not engaged, she is very likely to refer to him as the fidanzato. That happens a lot of the time, and in fact, I was struck by it at a party only a couple of weeks ago here in Rome, where a very sophisticated woman whom I know, who's in her 40s, and who I know has not been with her boyfriend for very long, introduced him as my fidanzato. So that preference for permanence is there. And it's an aspect of, I think, the generally conservative nature of Italian society. It's changing, and it's certainly changing among those Italians who have gone to live abroad. They're a different category altogether, I would say. Mm-hmm. But back here in Italy, the Italians do tend to opt for caution in many areas of their lives.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you explain a little bit more in the next chapter, the Italian family firm, and there are some myths and realities that are not always very well understood.
Yeah, there is that cliche, isn't there, of the Italian mom and pop store. The idea that Italians, to some extent, it's true. To some, what you find is that for a variety of reasons, partly because they begin as family firms, companies in Italy are on average smaller than in the rest of Europe and smaller than they should be. There are also tax reasons for that. There are historical reasons, because small companies were much favored under the Christian Democrats and so on. But the family also has a big influence. A lot of firms do start as family concerns. Having said that, they often don't remain as family firms, with the result that by the definitions used of family firms, where is the control? The country that has the most family firms in Europe turns out to be Finland, which is an utter surprise for people who are accustomed to the idea that family firms rule in Spain, Portugal, Italy, and so on. One of the problems that Italy faces, as it sticks with things that it has known in the past, which are tried and trusted, is indeed the family firm, because so many, or rather the small firm. One of the problems that Italy faces economically nowadays is its inability to grow its firms to a size that can compete effectively internationally and take advantage of economies of scale. So what you have here is a number of firms which are potentially much more influential and profitable than they are, which have remained that way because they've remained small. They've remained restricted. It's a big problem. If you look at the biggest firms, though, in Italy, a surprising number of them are family firms. Berlusconi's Mediaset, the Benetton empire, for example, Fiat, which has not long ago taken over Chrysler, or merged with Chrysler. That is still, or was until that point, still a family firm run by the Agnellis. So the family ethos remains very strong. I think one of the things that is, again, paradoxical in Italy is that Italian families are not necessarily any happier than families elsewhere. I know plenty of Italian families which are riven by all kinds of difficulties and jealousies and even hatreds. But the family bond remains extraordinarily strong. It is socially very badly seen not to respect your family or to do things for your family. So people are loyal to the family, but they don't necessarily get on within it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The Italian traditions have somewhat been restrictive in some ways, and somewhat, again, as you say, there are paradoxes all over in Italy. You went on to explore many of those restrictive practices in the chapter 15. Would you care to share some of those paradoxes and how it has changed in the last 100 years?
Yeah, Italy, like most Mediterranean societies, is built on what sociologists and anthropologists call client-patron relationships. In villages, for example, you would have a local figure of importance who would really decide everything, and he would be the person with whom you had to ingratiate yourself if you were going to get anywhere. Those sort of relationships have continued. For example, within politics, within the media, within all sorts of industries and sectors, you need a patron if you're going to get anywhere. You are going to need to attach yourself to somebody and be utterly loyal to that person in order to make progress. So that whole structure has remained astonishingly intact. I first came to Italy as a very young man, in my teens, way back in the late 60s. That pattern was in place then. It's still in place now. I say in the book that on the surface, Italy looks very much, can look to be very modern and cutting edge. It's what I call the Ferrari and Ferragamo impression that you get of Italy, of high fashion, advanced technology, and style. And all of that's true. The Italians are brilliant engineers, they're wonderful designers, and they have an innate good taste, I think. But coexisting with that is a social pattern that is not very different from the France of Émile Zola or the Britain of Jane Austen, where you need for your advancement to have somebody who can drag you up. And that has remained surprisingly unchanged, and I think that a lot of else stems from it. The tendency in Italy is, as I said earlier, to be cautious, and there are many areas in which Italy has lagged behind. It's also an area where I think that it's obstructed progress in many, many ways. And I'm surprised in a way that not more has changed. I still talk to people pretty much every week who bemoan the fact that, for example, a recent example, a friend of theirs who was a brilliant academic, had a patron within the university, and this patron had died, and this person's career at that point was over because it was too late in his career to attach himself to another patron, and he really was lost. That is the kind of thing universities, I would say, are a redoubt of this social pattern, and there's not much sign that they're going to change anytime soon. And that's crucial in a society because it means that the next generation is being formed with, in many cases, the ideas of not the generation before it, but the generation before that, because these barons, as they're called, stay on in the universities for, well, as long as they please. Some legislation has been brought in recently to make sure that they do retire sometime. They can't just stay there forever. But the situation is changing only very slowly. Having said that, and that's all the negative side, the positive side is that this attachment to the way that things have always been done is the reason why we have this divine Italian cuisine, for example. A lot of the dishes that you see on menus and in Italian patisserie, for example, are there for a reason, a tradition. There's a particular thing that you eat at a particular time of the year, or in some cases, I mentioned an example in Rome, on a particular day of the week. In Rome, you only eat gnocchi on Thursdays. Nobody knows why, but you just do. People remain attached to that idea. You go out on a Thursday still today, and there will be the gnocchi. That, I think, has allowed people to conserve ways of doing things, refine them a little bit, but keep what is good and not be swept away by what is new. And that's one of the reasons, I think, for a lot of the good things in Italy as well. It's a balance, but my fear is that if the Italian economy continues to stagnate, as it has done now for almost 15 years, that some of those traditions are going to be swept away whether people like it or not.
And how is the modern Italy, in your experience as you research the subject, is confronting with the age-old perception of of course, the mafia and the corruption? And at some point, mafia has almost influence of as much as 10% of the GDP. But Italians are very resilient, and they find ways around every law, as you can think of. What has kept the mafias so entrenched and haven't found a way around it?
Well, to some extent, they are also a product of these client-patron relationships that I mentioned. People who are used to them are much more prepared to accept that a boss will decide their fate and pay him the kind of tribute that he expects. So it is something that grows out of a traditional Mediterranean way of doing things. Why have they remained so resilient? Well, to some extent they haven't. The mafia in Sicily, after the fatal mistake by the then boss of all bosses, Totorina, to attack the state back in the early 90s with a campaign of terrorist bombs, came under such a devastating onslaught from the state that it has been perhaps permanently weakened. Certainly it has lost ground relative to the other two big mafia federations, if you like, who are the 'Ndrangheta in Calabria and the Camorra in Naples. Very different in character. The Camorra much more gangsters. The 'Ndrangheta is much closer in organization to the Sicilian mafia, Cosa Nostra. So to that extent, the mafias have retreated. On Sicily, I think that although their power is very considerable, it has shrunk, and it's certainly shrunk internationally, because the Sicilian mafia was heavily involved in the heroin business. The heroin business has retreated largely because of the AIDS epidemic. With regard to the other two, though, they are flourishing, and I think one of the most depressing developments since I've been involved in Italy as an adult, since I came back for the first time in 1994, has been the gradual spread of both of those organizations, but particularly the 'Ndrangheta, northwards through the country. In the days when I arrived here 20 years ago, you could say that the mafia was essentially a southern phenomenon. Okay, they had little outposts here and there dotted around northern Spain, northern Italy, but they were basically a phenomenon of the south. Now you can't say that. The presence of the 'Ndrangheta in Milan, for example, is genuinely worrying, not only because they are carrying out the normal kind of mafia tasks, such as extortion in the suburbs of the city, but there have been signs in the last few years of them making pacts with politicians of the kind that they have sealed in the south of the country. And that is very worrying, because Milan, apart from anything else, is the financial capital of Italy. The spread northwards has been accompanied also by greater internationalization. Again, 20 years ago, the 'Ndrangheta was confined pretty much to Calabria, and the Camorra was a phenomenon of Naples and the surrounding region. Now you find these people cropping up all over the place. They have a big presence in numerous countries around the world. So all of that is a very negative side of things.
In many ways, the Italian justice system is responsible for this, because of its very slow and unpredictable nature, has also contributed to the spread of the mafia and these corruption practices. How, or has there been any change in the Italian justice system?
Yeah, I would actually make a distinction there, because I think you're absolutely right when you say that it has contributed to corruption. A lot of people feel that because the system not only is very slow but gives you several chances, you automatically get 2 appeals, that if you do something bad, well, you're going to be able to find a court sooner or later who thinks that you didn't do something bad. And that often proves to be the case. So corruption actually, by and large, like tax evasion in Italy, pays. Having said that, the procedures for the mafia are different, and they can be tried pretty quickly. So for them, it's a different matter. What is certainly true is that the justice system acts as a huge drag on the country's economic development. The link may not be obvious, but if, for example, you steal my idea, right? I come in from Britain with an idea, and you, as an Italian, start making my goods, but at a lower cost, and don't pay me any kind of copyright dues. I take you to court. I can expect to wait 9 years before that case is resolved, and I get my money back. I'll probably win in the end, but the opportunity cost of those 9 years is vast. So the present government of Matteo Renzi is trying to update things, but it's a very difficult process. The backlog of cases is enormous, and they are concentrating only on the civil justice system, which is the one that so deters foreign investment in Italy. They are not going for the criminal justice system at the moment, and that does also need reform.
Fascinating book, fascinating subject. Moving on to the concepts of Italia. I mean, there's a question of identity, and you deal with it very nicely in the chapter 19. There are paradoxes, and there's a diversity, and the Italian society is slowly but surely homogenizing. And then we have a considerable and persistent north and south divide. Can you share some of the details about the how the society is changing in sometimes slowly, sometimes rapidly?
Yeah, well, it's yet another paradox. I apologize for coming back to this, but on the one hand, Italians, if you like, indigenous Italians are indeed homogenizing. It started particularly with military service, where people had to speak Italian because otherwise they just couldn't communicate. And television has played a huge role. In that sense, Silvio Berlusconi has helped unify Italy because his programs are very popular on his television channels, and his people who appear on those channels tend to speak a quite basic Italian that's comprehensible to people who might otherwise speak dialect, because for many years that was a hugely divisive factor in Italian society. The fact that if you were from the Veneto, for example, in the northeast, then you almost couldn't understand somebody from Calabria because you would be speaking radically different dialects. Now an awful lot of people do speak decent Italian and can communicate without problems, and to that extent the society is homogenizing. At the same time, as in so many other European societies, it is becoming more heterogeneous because of the number of immigrants that it has had to absorb, and that is an unresolved issue. We will only see, I think, over the next 20 years, the extent to which this relatively conservative society is prepared to adapt, or the extent to which it succeeds in integrating the people who've come in from outside. I think the jury is out. The surveys show that Italy is not as racist as France, but it is more racist, for example, than Spain. Having said that, I think that there is very little, except in the north, not very much overt racism that you see. There is a lot of racial insensitivity, and that I think is a problem. But it remains to be seen, I think, exactly where the balance is going to fall. So far, there have not been really significant problems with the ethnic minorities in Italy, but they could yet come. And there is, I think, a tendency in Italy towards a kind of outspoken criticism and hostility towards Muslims in particular that you don't find in other countries. And that has grown in recent years because of the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. So I think that is an area where there could be difficulties in future. Just today, for example, the governor of the biggest region in Italy and the richest, Lombardy, has described legislation, or rather a court ruling, saying that the Muslims should not have undue restrictions put on the building of mosques. He reacted to this in a nakedly Islamophobic way, saying, Allah Akbar. Now, that kind of thing really doesn't help. And I think that the Italians are in many ways fortunate in that they have a very varied migrant mix. It's not like France, for example, where you have an overwhelmingly North African presence. In Italy, there is a good mixture of people, and hopefully they can integrate without problems into Italian society. One of the barriers is the fact that they do not get an automatic right to citizenship if they are born in Italy. They have to wait until they're 18. And a lot of them complain of feeling discriminated when they are young because of the fact that they are not Italians. And that does not help. A lot of people have been pressing of late for that to be changed, and I think it will be changed in the not too distant future. The sooner it can be changed and that nationality rests on place of birth rather than blood, the better.
It's a very vast and detailed undertaking. What involved in researching the subject, in creating the book, in working with a lot of people and putting the book together? How long it took to start from the idea to the point you had the book?
About 3 years altogether, but I was doing other work in between, because I was during that period, for part of it, I was correspondent of both the Economist and the Guardian, so I had plenty to keep me busy while I was writing, and I actually found that I could only do it if I really took time out completely. The framing of the book, the creation of the structure was really quite difficult. I worked for many hours drawing lines on pieces of paper, trying to see where one bit would fit with another to make an entertaining book. Once I got writing, I found two things. I found, first of all, that lots of anecdotes sprang to mind. I'd tackle a particular subject, and I might have started off with one thought, and 6 would come jumbling into my mind, which was great, because it meant that for certain periods or certain passages, I wrote more quickly than I would have expected. At the same time, I found that some things that I had assumed turned out not to be true. As a journalist, I hate to say something unless I have a source for it. And in looking for a source, looking for an underpinning for my theory or assertion, I would often find that what I'd thought was not actually true at all. An outstanding example of that is in the section where I deal with crime, because we all have this idea that the mafia has turned Italy into a very violent country. Italy certainly has its law and order problems, and there's petty street crime in quite a few cities, and there is the presence of the mafia. But violent crime in Italy is astonishingly low compared to other European societies. Now, I ought to insert one word there: reported violent crime. In parts of Italy, the reported rate is low because you just don't report crime, and even if you do, the police are so busy with mafia affairs that they're not going to pay much attention. So the reported level is deceptive, but it is 1/8 of the level in Great Britain. Now, you can double, triple, or even quadruple that figure, and you still only get to half the level of the level in Britain, and that surprised me hugely. There are many other places that are not evident in the book where I looked into something and thought, no, what I thought was the sequence of logic actually is not, and I need to restructure this. And that involved often tearing apart what I'd done and putting it back together again. And that is what no author wants to do, because it's like pulling one thread out of a tapestry and the whole pattern can start to come apart. That made it a difficult book to write. Certainly, it was a more difficult book to write than any of the books I've written about Spain, because I think Italy is a more elusive, difficult to read and paradoxical society.
You did a masterful job in putting it all together in the book, The Italians, and thank you very much for your time and comments. It was a learning experience, and I hope our readers will be waiting for your next books as they come out.
So do I. Thank you very much indeed, Manish. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.